I am no craft show expert, but I did one recently at a local brewery and it went pretty well for me. Some of the ones I've done in the past have not gone great, but I thought I would tell about my experience at this one. In a previous video, I actually asked if you would be interested in seeing all about what I did at the craft show, and the overwhelming majority of you said yes, so that's why I'm putting together this video. Some of the mindset behind me preparing for this craft show was just how much stuff to make. You've got that balance of, am I making too many things? Am I not making enough? I erred on the side of making too many things and I actually way overshot it, and I'll talk more about that later, but you need to kind of figure out what that balance is for you. You need to determine ahead of time how you'll take payments. I was taking payments through Venmo and cash. Other options, you could do PayPal, you could do Square, you could do multiple other things, but think through that ahead of time and bring enough cash that you can make change for people if that's how they're paying. You also want to make it very easy for them to pay. I've seen some people print out QR codes that people could just scan, and that way they can easily pay you. The easier you can make that, the less friction you can have on that transaction, the more likely someone is to buy. Another thing that I thought of ahead of time, and you need to if you're going to do a craft show, is what types of things do you want to make? What is the venue you're going to? Is it a holiday feature? Is it surrounding a particular theme of things? For this one, I was at a local brewery, so I did some beer and related things, thinking that that would be the audience that was there. But along those lines, once you figure out the actual types of items, I wanted to make items that I could make very quickly, have very little cost in, so that my margins could stay high even if I offered those at a lower price point. One final thought I had ahead of time is I really wanted to have things in a variety of price ranges. That way, if someone's coming up, they want to spend $6 or spend $10, they could do that. But you don't want to write off those people that potentially might want to spend more. So have a range of items, including some that you might even think are too expensive, because you never know, you might sell some of those. Now it's time to talk about how to price your items. Even with inflation and shifting prices, I find that people will pretty readily spend $20 or under without thinking much about it. So I definitely wanted to have quite a few items that were under that so that people could just kind of impulse buy and not think much about it. In fact, I had some items like ornaments and bottle openers that were under $10 to really hone in on that impulse buy. I don't know what you charge for labor, but it would do you well to come up with whatever your day rate is of what it costs for you to work for an entire day in your shop. That will help you determine the price of different things that you're making and selling, determining how long it took to make those, whether it was, CNC time or sanding or whatever, and kind of splitting that up and attributing it to that particular item. That being said, we also live in reality, and the market will only bear what it will bear. You can say this is worth something, and at a certain point, it probably is, but if the market humans are not willing to pay that for it, then it's probably not actually worth that. There are some things you just can't make an ideal margin on. There are quite a few things that I have made and like to make and think they are really neat and nice looking, but I can't make a good enough margin on them, so I just can't make and sell those. For instance, years ago, I took a model that the Wood Whisperer did on a salt cellar, kind of put a different spin on it for something I wanted to do, and made some of those. They took me so long to make that I would have had to charge over probably $125 to really recoup my cost on the labor that it took me. I either need to get faster or just sell them for a ridiculous price, which was not going to happen. I don't think anyone's going to pay $125 for a salt cellar. Therefore, I don't sell those anymore because it's just not worth my time. Another method for larger projects that people use to price their work are the cost of materials times 3 plus some kind of a markup, like 30% for overhead, blades, electricity you're using, that kind of thing. I don't know how well that works on small items like this. I have used a similar version for larger things like furniture pieces or whatever, but that's something to keep in mind. If you feel like this is valuable information so far, I would love if you would subscribe to the channel. If you're finding value from it, I try to put out things that help people or inform in different ways, and I would appreciate your subscription. All right, it's time to talk about setting up your booth. If you're doing an outside event like this was for me, you want to consider the elements, the sun. You don't want to just sit there and bake the whole time. Be sure you have a canopy or something like that. I didn't have one. I did have a table, but between my friend who I was kind of doing a co-booth with and he had 2 canopies and we put together some tables and made it work. It's always good to bring some chairs because often that you don't have those options when you're at the event. So bring some camp chairs. Be sure to bring some water to stay hydrated, and just don't discount those things, because usually you get busy and you kind of forget that stuff. It's very important. If you have some really small items, it's a good idea to have some large bowls or containers to set those in. I made these small bottle openers, and I had some different Christmas ornaments, and I had these large porcelain bowls that were from my grandparents that looked really cool and kind of vintage. Well, they were vintage, and just made for a nice display to set some things in. All right, now on to the items that I actually made. Again, I wanted a wide variety, so I started way ahead of time, probably more than a month, just kind of running stuff in the background, and come to find out I made too much stuff. I just mentioned that I made a lot of bottle openers. These were really good for me because the inserts, the actual metal pieces that you put in there to crack open the bottle, were not very expensive. I'll have links below to the ones that I used, and I was able to use up a ton of scraps. Really small pieces that I wouldn't have been able to use on pretty much anything else I could use for those bottle openers. They were pretty time consuming though, because I was using scraps, so everything was a little bit different size. I was trying to avoid, holes and cracks and this and that, so just take that into advisement. As far as pricing for those, I priced them at $6 a piece. They were kind of my loss leader. I wanted everybody to come and grab one, pick it up, like it. And I often would do something where I would offer like 2 for $10, and that seemed to work pretty well. Often people would pick up a couple of them rather than just one. You've probably seen some of those clean, dirty dishwasher signs, and I wanted to make a kind of a new variant on that. These were a little swanky. Ended up having some leather on the back with some nice magnets to hold it. That way it wouldn't scratch your dishwasher. The material was pretty much free as far as the wood, because it was some stuff I've had lying around for a long time, and this allowed me to just use it up. The leather was also left over from another project, so that didn't cost me anything, but the magnets were a little bit pricey. They were about $2.50 per item worth of magnets, so it really hurt my profitability as far as those items. I sold those for $12 a piece because most of the work was pretty quick and was done on the CNC or the laser, and I could just move on with something else while that was running. My buddy Drew from Fisher's Shop actually did a version of this, but for when they fed their dog or not, years ago on his channel. So I'll link below to that. And if you don't know, I do a podcast with Drew from Fisher's Shop and Mark from Gunflint Designs called We Built a Thing. I'd love for you to check it out. Go find it wherever you listen to podcasts. I made some charcuterie recipe boards, and these were just 2 different styles of charcuterie board that I cut out on the CNC. And I have 7 different recipes that I laser engraved into the front of them, just kind of mixing and matching in those 2 different sizes. I sold a few of those. They did pretty well, and because I was able to make them decently fast, I could offer them at a lower price point. I purposefully left the back side of those blank so that if someone didn't want to have the recipe showing, they could flip it over and still use it as a charcuterie board, and that way it was kind of dual purpose. I had some smaller kind of odd size cutting boards that I had made just out of scraps here and there. They didn't really kind of fit into any other category, so I thought about sprucing them up with some other laser engraving. I found this measurement cheat sheet where it kind of tells, this many cups is in a pint and so on and so forth. Those seem to do pretty well. I made some oil and bread boards. I actually got this idea from a friend of mine, and I thought it was a really cool idea. So it's basically just a serving board of some sort, kind of longer more than it is wide. So that you could put a loaf of French bread or Italian bread on there, and then I actually used the CNC to carve out a little recess and found these really cool geometric ramekins to slot down in there. You could pour some oil in there and serve that at a party or something and have like an oil and bread board. Those sold pretty well for me. I made these really large live edge serving boards out of some really figured cherry, and everyone came over and talked about them and picked them up, and no one bought one. That really surprised me. I did a previous video on that, so I'll put a link to that below on how I made those boards, but it really surprised me that it caught everyone's attention and no one bought them. But they were at the high end of my price range. Just like I told you, I wanted some things that were higher end. Those definitely had more labor in them, so I needed to charge more. I was just really surprised they didn't sell. Another simple item I made were some farmhouse style candlesticks. I just turned these out of some 2x4s that I glued up. I had about $20 worth of 2x4s and some time in gluing them and turning them on the lathe, and They didn't sell as well as I thought they would. I was selling them in groups of 3 for about $18, which was pretty reasonable. And I think I sold 1 set. So I'm not sure why this particular event, maybe because it was at the brewery and that style didn't go with what people were looking for. I'm not quite sure. One of my best sellers were these Santa boards. So it's basically just a big serving board with something laser engraved all over the front of it saying, here's a cookie for you, Santa, here's a carrot for Rudolph, place your milk here. And it's just kind of a neat thing for family to use on Christmas Eve to set out some milk and cookies. I made 4 of those for the show and I ended up selling 3 of them. So that was probably my hottest item. In yet another attempt to use up scraps, I made some kind of farmhouse style signs out of some big blocky reclaimed stuff. 2 of them were actually made out of scrap walnut that I probably couldn't have done much else with. It kind of had some cracks and this and that, but I painted and kind of distressed them and then carved through it, and it just lent itself to the overall look. They did okay. I sold a couple of them. I had them priced pretty cheap at like $12 or $15 because other than a little bit of CNC time, I just purchased designs from Etsy, so I didn't even really have much design time in them. I had hoped that they would sell a little better because my margins on those would have been crazy, but sometimes that's just how it happens. A couple more of the larger, higher priced items that I made were some of my really large 12 by 18 cutting boards. That's a standard cutting board that I make for a lot of people. I make them for realtors. I customize them for their clients, and I had an example of that with the customization on the front, as well as a few that were just plain. And they got quite a few looks, but I didn't sell any of those at the show. The other items were some really large teardrop shaped boards. These were big statement pieces, and again, they were toward the higher end of the price range. I sold a couple of them, but I think I made 8, so I just made way too many of them. Finally, I had a few odd style small cutting boards that I just called cocktail boards. And I just put those in there to be at a different price range than basically anything else. So as I was mentioning earlier, I had different categories of things. A lot of my stuff was for the kitchen or kind of drink related, but I wanted a few other things, which is mostly why I mixed in the candlesticks and some of those farmhouse things. I didn't know if it would go with this audience, but I was hoping that it would just catch somebody in case they weren't all into the kitchen or serving related things that I was selling. Let me talk about design for just a minute. It's great if you have the design capability. I can design some things, and I came up with the graphic that was on the bottle openers and a few other things, but I'm not the best designer, and that's okay if you're not either. Just outsource that. Just look on Etsy, look on some of the design websites, and buy commercially available designs for a little bit of money that you can either then tweak, put on something, and then resell. Don't fret too much about that. Don't spend all of your time trying to design. I actually had a conversation on Instagram recently with somebody, and I found it interesting. They were saying they didn't have a laser and they wanted to customize things, but really wondering if they should buy a laser to do it. They weren't sure if they were ready to buy a laser. The first year that I made a lot of these large cutting boards that I made, this was 5 or 6 years ago, I actually outsourced the laser work for all of them. I didn't own a laser yet. I found a local place, it was actually a trophy shop, that had a big laser engraver. I went and negotiated a rate on this basic style, and then every time I would make a sale, I would make the cutting board, take it to them, give them the file to engrave, or files if they were doing multiples, and a couple days later I would pick them up and finish them. I would just have to factor in that price and either lose a little bit more money because I'm outsourcing that and it's a cost to me, or I would actually, just add that into the cost. But there are options. If you don't have some of these machines to customize things, don't worry about it. Just find someone that's local to you that's willing to help you with it. They'll probably jump at the opportunity because it will help their small business as well as helping your small business. All right, I want to talk about selling strategy. This may sound harsh or something, but you can't expect to set all this stuff up and just sit at your booth at the back of the booth and not talk to anybody and sell a whole lot. That's my opinion, but I think when you speak to people, talk to them about what they're interested in, ask them how their day's going, interact with them, it really does help your chances of selling. I say speak to everyone who walks by. It will at least sometimes make them acknowledge you. If you see them at the corner of your booth looking at your ornaments or whatever you have going there, ask them about them and go ahead and announce the price that they are, because even though you may have prices sitting around, that just kind of breaks the ice. They don't have to search for that, because often that's what people are wondering when they come up to your booth is, what does this cost? I actually forgot to mention that in setting up the booth. I laser engraved a couple of price sheets on some plywood that I had and just had those sitting around so that people could kind of see, okay, this item is this much, or this item is this much. I probably could have done a better job at labeling what the prices were. Kind of ran out of time of doing that, and it was very hectic at the show with a lot of people there, but it seemed to work pretty well overall. Another part of selling strategy is toward the end of the show, start wheeling and dealing. The more things you can sell, if you're fine with selling them at a little bit of a discounted rate, the more things you sell, you don't have to drag back home. Toward the end of it, I was not selling some of those candlesticks, and I actually had, this was back right before Halloween, I actually had a bunch of wooden jack-o'-lanterns, and I didn't want to keep those for an entire other season since we were already almost past that. A lady came up, she was interested, I think I had 8 or 9 of them, and she was kind of hemming and hawing, and I said, make me an offer. She didn't say anything. I said, all of them for 35 bucks. And she said, okay. And she was still hesitant a little bit, and I said, I'll walk them to your car for you. So just do what it takes, make the sale, and you know, as it gets toward the end, just start wheeling and dealing a little bit. All right, let's talk money. I know you're interested to find out what I made at this show, and I'm gonna tell you. I brought in a few $100s of 1s, 5s, and 10s because I figured people would have 20s and maybe even larger bills if they happen to be, you know, spending some. I took in the most payments on Venmo. It just happened to be what most people were familiar with and one of the digital ways that I was using. I happened to take in, let me consult my notes. I took in $770.90 on Venmo, only $32 net in cash. So I brought way too much to make change for a total of $852.90. I consider that a pretty good amount, and I'm pretty happy with it. Like I mentioned at some craft fairs in the past, I've barely made enough to even pay back the booth fee, so I was pretty thrilled with this. So what were my best selling items and worst selling items? I would say the Santa boards were probably the best selling item. I brought 4 of those and I sold 3 of them pretty quickly. Other good sellers were those recipe boards and the bottle openers. Those just seemed to be popular. The bottle openers, it was just like a give me. They were so cheap, people couldn't help but just buy them. And the recipe boards were pretty unique. I had not seen anything else around there that was like that. Some of the worst sellers for me were the ornaments. I made 2 different styles of ornaments, some that were kind of just cute or nice looking, and then some that were funny. And everyone picked up the funny ones and laughed about it and this and that, and then just set them right back down and walked away. I might have sold a few of them, but I think I made something like 60 of them because I really thought they would be popular. Again, we were in October, so it was a little before everybody was frantically buying for Christmas, but there were other booths that had Christmas stuff out there, and I really thought these would be more popular. All right, let's wrap this up. What are some of my closing thoughts? What would I do again? What would I not do again? I think I had maybe too many items at my booth. I've stated that a couple times, but you know how certain people will kind of get paralysis by so many choices? I think that was plaguing me at the booth. They just sat there basically frozen in non-decision. I wish I had made some stands to hold the cutting boards upright. I think that would have helped display them a little bit better. I've seen some other people do that, and I think going forward, if I did this again, that would be a good idea. We had some big potato crates that we had them sitting vertically in, almost like a record crate or something like that, and people could thumb through them, but it just wasn't the best way to display them. Don't underestimate how long these items are gonna take for you to make and finish, mostly because a lot of my items were for the kitchen. They needed a food safe oil, and I needed to sand them up to a certain amount for me to be happy with them. All of those serving boards, I sanded at 80, after the CNC or whatever I was using to cut them out, then 120, then had to raise the grain and wait for them to dry, and then sand them to 220 and then oil them. It was just a big process on a lot of items. I think I estimated I worked 90 hours the week of the craft show to finish up everything I had kind of started and set in the background just to make sure I could actually take it to the craft show. And there were still a few items that I didn't finish in time to take. Know how you're going to finish each item. If it's something that's gonna get spray lacquer on it, you don't have to sand those quite as high. Like the bottle openers, I sprayed lacquer on those, and I only went up to about 120 on those because after a couple of coats of lacquer, they feel great. One final thought is, consider the amount of inventory you're going to have left over. That's one reason I've not liked doing many craft shows in the past, is I end up with inventory sitting in my house and I don't know what to do with it after the fact. I have a hard time kind of selling something that's already made. A lot of what I do is made to order with customization for somebody. So definitely consider that. I went a little heavy on making items because I have an Etsy store and a website that I do sell things on, and I have some contacts locally that have since bought some stuff. All of those live edge serving boards I've sold to a realtor. He loved it and wanted all 3 of them. And I didn't sell any of them at the craft show. So if you have some other outlets like that you're able to offload some of these things, I'd recommend making more than you think you could sell at the show. If you don't have those other outlets already established, maybe go a little lighter.